it sounds like I missed my introduction. I apologize for that. We were lost in the hallway. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to share some thoughts about marriage policy, really. Why the state's in the marriage business, what marriage is, why marriage matters, and how to talk about marriage in a civil way, in a reasonable way, in a rational way, simply as a matter of philosophy. So what I want to do this morning is think through the question of what marriage is and why marriage matters and why the state ought not redefine marriage. And it's appropriate that we're doing this at a university because there are good arguments on both sides of the marriage debate. Unfortunately, there's a lot of demagoguing, a lot of name-calling, a lot of incivility that takes place on this particular issue. On both sides of the question. It's not as if one side of this debate has acted in a pristine and morally upright way, and the other side has been the one that's engaged in inappropriate behavior. Both sides have too often engaged in sloganeering and name-calling, so being at a university gives us an opportunity to actually think through the question. And so what I want to do is make an argument that appeals to philosophy and social science and public policy. You won't hear me make any appeals to the Bible or to theology. You won't hear me make any moral arguments about the morality of same-sex relationships or same-sex actions. And you won't hear me make any appeals to tradition just as a sheer fact of tradition. There's some conservatives that sometimes, these are Burkean conservatives that will say, well, this is the way things have been, therefore this is the way things ought to be. My argument's going to be normative through and through. Now, my opponents, they have a very clever slogan. It's a good slogan in the sense that it fits on a bumper sticker. Marriage equality. If you're on Facebook or Twitter, you can put up a red equal sign as your Facebook icon or your Twitter avatar. It's a wonderful slogan. It's utterly empty when it comes to actual intellectual content. Everyone in this chapel is in favor of marriage equality. We all want to see the law treat all marriages equally. What we might have a disagreement about, both inside of this chapel and outside with the broader culture, is what sort of a relationship is a marriage? And only if you can answer that question can you then answer the question about equality. So before you get to debates about marriage equality, you have to answer the question of marriage reality. And so the reason that we titled the book that I co-authored a book with a classmate of mine at Princeton and with a professor of ours at Princeton. We titled it, What is Marriage? Because that's the central question in this debate. And only if you can answer that question can you then judge whether any given marriage policy is good or bad, whether any given law is violating equality or upholding the principles of equality. So when we were doing research for the book, we read through a bunch of the academic articles, the books that have been written in favor of redefining marriage to include same-sex couples. And what we saw was that their implicit definition of what marriage is, because frequently they wouldn't answer the what is marriage question. Frequently they would just say, well, we're in favor of marriage equality, and then take for granted some understanding of what marriage itself actually is. What we discovered as we were doing this research is that they had a vision of marriage that saw marriage as mainly an intense emotional union. That marriage is about, in the words of philosopher at Wayne State University, John Corvino, establishing your number one person. Marriage is the relationship that's your most important relationship. It's the one that you care for another person, you're romantically involved with another person, you live with each other, you have a joint checking account, both of your names are on the deed of the house, on the mortgage. That's more or less the vision of marriage. It's about an intense, emotional, romantic, caregiving union. But this understanding of marriage itself simply gets marriage wrong. It gets marriage wrong in obvious ways. It can't explain traditional marital norms that we've upheld in American law throughout our history and through most of Western culture. Nor can it distinguish marriage from just companionship in general. If marriage is just about an emotional union, how is it different than companionship? Indeed, if marriage is simply about an intense emotional union, why should it be permanent? Your feelings can wax and wane, they can come and they can go. What is it about marriage that requires the commitment till death do us part? If if it's simply about consenting adult love? And if that's your vision of marriage, why should it be a sexually exclusive union? Some people might find that their romantic caregiving relationship is actually enhanced by extramarital sexual relationships. So what is it about marriage just as such, if it's an emotional, romantic, caregiving relationship, that says that sexual relations are reserved for marriage? And then lastly, if marriage is simply about consenting adult love, why is it the union of two and only two people? Larger ensembles can commit to one another, they can care for one another, they can love one another. If this is your vision of marriage, why limit it to twosomes? But then lastly, if this is your vision of marriage, why is the government in the marriage business at all? We normally don't have the state regulate our friendships. The state's not in your business with your best friend or with your teammates. Why do we have the state regulating your love life if marriage is simply about consenting adult love? This vision of marriage, we argue, simply gets marriage wrong. It dissolves the marital relationship into contract law, where consent is the only factor that defines the family. And if you've noticed, there's nothing that I've said so far that says that this vision of marriage is somehow distinctively homosexual, that this vision of marriage is somehow distinctively the province of same-sex relationships. This vision of marriage informs many heterosexual relationships. In fact, we opened the book by recounting a New York Times wedding announcement of a straight couple that were divorcing both of their spouses, whom they had already had children with. They met at their children's kindergarten parent-teacher night. They were divorcing their current spouses and were going to marry each other because they said that that's where their heart lied. So this vision of marriage as consenting adult romance has been informing American culture since the sexual revolution. This is the vision that we get out of the 60s, that love makes a family and that marriage should last only as long as the love lasts. This is the vision of human sexuality and marriage that gave us the hookup culture and no-fault divorce, the pornography epidemic, and the exploding rates of births to single mothers. And obviously, none of those phenomena are to be blamed on gays or lesbians. It's not as if somehow same-sex relationships caused the sexual revolution and all of the breakdowns that we've seen over the past 40 years. The point here is that there's a common vision of what marriage is, and it's a faulty vision of what marriage is that fuels both of those movements. And that the push to legally redefine marriage would solidify the faulty vision of marriage in our law and therefore in our culture. And so if you think the past 40 years have been a mistake, that we've taken several steps down a dead end, and that this has caused harm both for parents, for children, and for society as a whole, why would you now want to enshrine that bad vision of marriage in law and therefore make it that much harder to ever recover a sound vision of marriage? That's the basic argument here. There are two visions of marriage. Neither hinges on orientation or same-sex anything. There's two different visions of what marriage is, and I'm arguing that one of them is false. So let me now move into a positive argument for what I think the true vision of marriage is and why. And I'm going to do this in 3 steps. So it'll be first, what is marriage? Second, why does marriage matter? And then third, the consequences of redefining marriage. And so for the first question, what is marriage? We argue that marriage is a comprehensive union, and that it's comprehensive in 3 respects. It's comprehensive in the acts that spouses engage in. It's comprehensive in the goods that spouses are ordered towards. And it's comprehensive in the norms or the commitments that spouses make to each other. And we get this general framework right from Aristotle. So right from a 2,500-year-old philosophical tradition. Ancient Greek thinker Aristotle taught us that you can analyze any institution by looking to those 3 factors: the acts, the goods, and the norms, or the commitments that they make.
And to illustrate this, let me take the example of an academic institution. What is it about a university that makes it an academic institution rather than a sports team or a commercial enterprise? What is it that makes your school an academic institution rather than a professional football team or just some money-making enterprise? And here we're going to say those three things: you engage in academic actions, you pursue academic goods, and you live by academic commitments. What does this mean? The bread and butter of a university are those academic actions. Things like delivering lectures. Your teachers, your professors will deliver lectures, and you as students will attend those lectures, take notes. Your professors will go to the library and do research so they can then publish their next article, publish their next book. And then lo and behold, on a syllabus next year, that book or that article will be on your syllabus. You'll read it. At the end of the semester, you'll write a term paper. Your professor will grade that term paper. You might meet during office hours to discuss the paper, to discuss the lectures. Those are the sort of activities that really go to the heart and soul of a university as an academic community, academic actions. What are all of those actions ordered towards? What are you seeking in all of those actions? You're seeking the good of the truth. All of the activities that you engage in as a university student are ordered towards knowledge of the truth. They're not here to try to prop up whatever opinion you happen to have because it's your opinion. They're not here to engage in propaganda as if you're a partisan for some side of a debate and you're just going to make the most witty arguments to defend it. No, all of the things you do are ordered towards eliminating ignorance from your life, eliminating error from your life, eliminating false beliefs, and coming to hold true beliefs, knowledge of the truth. And then lastly, those two things, academic actions and academic goods, can explain the academic norms that you live by. It can explain the honor code. It can explain academic honesty and academic dishonesty. It can explain why you're not supposed to plagiarize your papers, why you're supposed to cite all of your sources if you're a researcher, why you're not supposed to data mine if you're a scientist. The idea here is that you're supposed to engage by the norms that make it most likely that your academic actions will reach the conclusion of the truth. So that if another scholar comes along and reads a paper you've written and said, hey, I think you made a mistake here. I think you misinterpreted the data. You don't interpret that as an offensive remark. You don't see that as like they're slighting you. You actually see it as something that's liberating. They're helping you make a better argument. They're eliminating mistakes from your own scholarship. At least that's how universities should operate. The problem in American culture is that far too few of our universities do operate that way. But you can see how this can explain what makes a university different than a football team, even though you might have a football team, different than a corporation, even though money clearly sustains a university. Let's now apply this analysis to the marital relationship. We now have to do this because something that all of our grandparents took for granted, it was simply common sense, common knowledge that everyone knew that marriage was a permanent, exclusive, monogamous union of husband and wife. We now have to actually explain why. And we can do that through the same basic three-step program. Look at the acts that spouses engage in, the goods that spouses pursue, and the norms that they live by, the commitments that they make to one another. So let's start by saying marriage is a comprehensive union in that it unites spouses comprehensively, a union of hearts, minds, and bodies. It unites spouses at all levels of their personhood. Marriage is comprehensive in that it orders spouses towards comprehensive goods, not just the good of passing the next test or winning the next football game, the good of forming the type of bond that can create new life and then raise new life to maturity. And then lastly, marriage calls for comprehensive commitments. There are comprehensive norms that govern the lives of spouses, comprehensive throughout time, that pledge of permanency, comprehensive at every moment in time, the pledge of exclusivity. Let me unpack this. This is the densest part of the talk, but this is also the most essential, the most kind of central part of the talk. So I started by saying that there's comprehensive action. There's an act that will unite spouses comprehensively. We can start by saying, if I'm going to make the point that two people can be united in a single action to become one, what is it that makes us a single act? Because to unite with another person, it's going to have to involve all levels of our personhood. And we aren't just ghosts and machines. We're not just souls that somehow inhabit bodies, but we're a mind-body unity. And so this action that we're going to engage in is going to have to unite us at the level of hearts, minds, and bodies. Ordinary friendships are only unions of hearts and minds. The marital relationship entails that bodily dimension. And so what is it that makes each and every one of you one body? Why are you not just a clump of cells? Why are you not just a heap of tissue? It's that all of your various organs, all of your various body parts are coordinating with each other for the common good of your biological life. As an individual, your heart, your lungs, your kidney, your muscles, your bones, your skin, all of your various organs and subsystems are integrated with each other so that when it comes to locomotion or digestion or respiration or circulation, each and every one of us in this chapel is complete as an individual. My heart is pumping, my blood is circulating, my lungs are respirating, putting oxygen into my blood. When I'm done with this talk, I'll walk off the stage, locomotion on my own. We're all complete in those respects as individuals. We're all radically incomplete with respect to one bodily function. There's one bodily function that requires a twosome. It requires a twosome to such a great extent that when the Hebrew scriptures talk about the two becoming one flesh, they're not simply speaking metaphorically or poetically, that two people are in love with each other to such a great extent, it's as if the two became one, that the Hebrew Bible there is actually revealing something true about human nature, something true about the created order, something true about who and what we are. So that a man and a woman, when they unite through a conjugal action, a comprehensive union is formed to such a great extent that 9 months later, it might require a name. And so that begins to tell us something about the good that the marital relationship is ordered towards. The action that unites man and woman comprehensively into a single unity as husband and wife is the same action that then creates new human life. The love-making act is also the life-giving act. And in the same way that academic actions are ordered towards academic goods, knowledge of the truth, so too the marital act is ordered towards a marital good, the creation of new human life, but then also the rearing of that new human life. Conscientious husbands and wives, mothers and fathers will then cooperate with each other to raise that child to maturity so the child becomes an autonomous, law-abiding, productive member of society. And now when you're thinking about human goods, finite and infinite, there's nothing more comprehensive in this earthly life that you could commit yourself to than the creation and then raising of an entire new human being. So it gives marriage a comprehensive orientation, unlike the orientation of passing your class, graduating from college, getting a job, winning a football game. Those are all discrete, particularized goods. In the way that this marital good is a comprehensive, open-ended good that spouses are ordered towards. And for spouses to do a good job at raising their children, it will require that they help their children appreciate human goodness in all of its forms. So marriage is ordered towards this comprehensive good in that you're going to help your children appreciate truth and beauty and God and knowledge and athleticism and friendship and any particular good that you can think of. That's the type of thing that you're going to want to raise your children to be open to embracing. Not forcing anything on them, but helping them to embrace all of human goodness in all of its infinite varieties. This then explains the third step of the analysis, the norms that spouses live by. Why is it that spouses make a permanent and an exclusive commitment to one another? Most of you haven't made that sort of a commitment to your freshman year roommate. You don't pledge to live with your freshman year roommate till death do you part. You don't pledge to never have another roommate. Why is it that you make that commitment to your spouse? And it's precisely because your freshman year roommate, you didn't make a comprehensive commitment to them. You didn't try to form a comprehensive union with your roommate. You do that with your spouse. And this can explain why and what we mean by it. Start with the question of exclusivity. Marriage doesn't call for intellectual exclusivity. If any of you are married, you're not cheating on your spouse by attending this lecture. This isn't the type of exclusivity we're talking about. It's not academic exclusivity. Marriage calls for sexual exclusivity because it's that sexual act that transforms an ordinary companionship relationship, a union of hearts and minds, into the marital domain. It's that sexual act that is distinctive of marriage, which is why it's also called the marital act, because it transforms a union of hearts and minds into the bodily dimension and therefore into the comprehensive dimension. And this is why the type of exclusivity that marriage calls for is sexual exclusivity. While you might not be cheating on your spouse by attending this lecture, if you sleep with someone other than your spouse tonight, you are cheating on your spouse. And this vision of what marriage is can explain why. Likewise, to make a comprehensive commitment to your spouse, it has to be a permanent commitment. It needs to be comprehensive throughout time. To engage in a temporary marriage union where you say, well, I'm going to marry you as long as things are going well, but I'm going to have an escape plan. I'm going to marry you, but only for as long as our love lasts. When that fades, I'm out of here. If you have any conditions on your commitment to your spouse, you're not uniting comprehensively. Whatever condition you place on it, that is what's limiting the comprehensiveness of your union. This basic vision of marriage that I've just laid out and that my co-authors and I elaborate on at great length in the book is something that we see in ancient philosophy and politics. So it's not just Christian and Jewish thinkers, it's in Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Plutarch, Lucinius Rufus, both ancient Greeks and Romans. We see it in the canon law of the church, but also in the common law of England and in the civil law of the United States. We see it in Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Immanuel Kant. We see it in Eastern thinkers like Gandhi. They don't all articulate it the way I just did. I articulated it within an Aristotelian framework using some jargon that comes out of Aristotle. But different theological, philosophical, and political communities, more or less throughout human history and all across the globe, have been articulating some version of this argument within their own particular vocabularies, their own particular frameworks, because they've been trying to articulate something true about human nature. With various levels of success, with various levels of sophistication, various communities have been trying to articulate the truth about marriage. And that's why we see something that looks like this repeated throughout human history. And the argument here isn't that, well, because this is traditionally how it's been done, this is how we should be doing it. The argument here is that there's rationality inside of this universal human consensus. That there's a reason why human communities throughout human history and across the globe ordered their families in this way. And that those reasons are the things that I've tried to articulate from within an Aristotelian framework. So let me move on to the second question, because you could say, we're willing to accept your argument that this is what marriage is, that it's a comprehensive union of sexually complementary spouses where a man and a woman unites in this comprehensive act as husband and wife, and then they live by comprehensive norms as mother and father. Why should we care? More importantly, why should the government care? Why should the states be regulating marriage and defining marriage as a male-female union? Let me get at that. From a policy perspective, marriage really exists to unite a man and a woman as husband and wife, so that any children that their union produces have the love and the care of their mother and their father. So understood, marriage is based on an anthropological truth that men and women are distinct and complementary. It's based on a biological fact that reproduction requires both a man and a woman, and it's based on a social reality that children deserve both a mother and a father. Whenever a child is born, a mother is always close by. She's normally in the same room. That's a fact of biology. The question for culture, and therefore the question for law, is will a father be close by, and if so, for how long? Marriage is the institution that different societies across the globe and throughout human history devised to maximize the likelihood that that man commits to that woman, and then the two of them, committed to each other, commit to that child. And that when this doesn't happen, social costs run high. Social costs run high for that child, for that mother, and for the entire community. Let me explain the reasons why the social costs run high. First factor is that there's no such thing as parenting. There's no such thing as parenting in the abstract. There's mothering and there's fathering. Moms and dads bring different gifts to the parenting enterprise. Fathers interact with children in a discrete and tangible way that's different and complementary from the way mothers do. We have good social science on this. Let me read you just a short quote from a social scientist at Rutgers University who had investigated about 40 years worth of social science on parenting, and this is what he concluded. Quote, "The burden of social science supports the idea that gender-differentiated parenting is important for human development and that the contribution of fathers to child rearing is unique and irreplaceable. We should disavow the notion that mommies can make good daddies, just as we should disavow the popular notion that daddies can make good mommies. The two sexes are different to the core, and each is necessary culturally and biologically for the optimal development of a human being." End quote. Now, what's Professor Popenoe getting at when he highlights that evidence? Let me illustrate it with a simple thought experiment. If I tell you it's Saturday morning, and there's a 5-year-old boy in the living room, and he's wrestling with one of his parents, and this parent is teaching the boy how to be masculine without being violent, that it's okay to put people in headlocks, but it's not okay to pull hair or to bite or to gouge out eyes. Which parent is most likely in the living room? And the nervous laughter gives it away that it's the father. And it's not because we've engaged in gender stereotypes in which only dads get to wrestle on living room carpets with their boys. It's that this is the sort of behavior that comes naturally to fathers. This is the type of thing that dads enjoy doing with their sons. In the same way that fathers are more likely to throw a newborn baby in the air, and mothers are more likely to say, "Honey, not so high." That's a behavior that comes naturally to mothers. Not because we've engaged in gender stereotypes in which moms have to be concerned about what their dads do, because mothers tend to be more nurturing, more compassionate, more sympathetic. Women tend to be those things in general. This is what comes naturally to a mother, especially after carrying a child in her womb for 9 months. It can make sense why the mom's more attuned to the compassion and the care and the nurturing after she's carried the child for 9 months. Now, what happens with the 5-year-old in the living room, something similar happens with the 10-year-old in the backyard, maybe tossing around a football with his father, or with the 15-year-old boy getting ready for his first high school dance, maybe talking with his dad as he puts on a tuxedo or a suit for a semi-formal dance, something like that. What is taking place with the 5-year-old, the 10-year-old, the 15-year-old in those distinctively kind of father-son moments is that the dad is helping his son develop into a mature man. And when you take a step back from the anecdotes that I just shared, look at the data, we see boys who grow up without their fathers more likely to commit crime, less likely to graduate from high school, more likely to spend time in jail, less likely to be employed. The reason why, it's that the father has that unique ability to help his young boy develop into a law-abiding, productive man. Fathers do something similar but complementary for their daughters. Fathers tend to be the ones who police who their daughter is dating. Fathers tend to be the ones that scare away the bad boyfriend. Partly this is because fathers tend to be bigger than mothers. They tend to be taller than mothers. Fathers tend to have deeper voices than mothers. So they're better equipped at scaring away bad boyfriends. Fathers also tend to have once been boys themselves. And so they know what the wrong sort of boy might be looking for in their daughter. So they have a greater sensitivity to who it is that's taking their daughter on a date. A father who is married to his daughter's mother also models what a good male-female relationship looks like. A father who's married to his daughter's mother models for her what she might look for in a boyfriend and a potential husband. So when we take a step back from the anecdote and we look at the social science on this, we see that girls who grow up without their fathers more likely to start sexual behavior earlier in life, more likely to have a pregnancy outside of marriage. That the father plays a discrete and tangible role in her life. If you don't trust me on the science, let me read you a quotation that very nicely summarizes this. And then I'm going to ask you who the speaker is. Here's the quote. "We know the statistics. Children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They're more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it." End quote. Who's the speaker? President Obama. Now, why is it that President Obama has spoken out on the importance of fathers? Because he's done this several times during his 2 terms in the White House. He gave an explanation when he addressed the all-male graduating class of the historically black college, Morehouse College. And here's what he said, quote, "I have tried to be for Michelle and my girls what my father was not for my mother and me. I want to break that cycle." End quote. And so President Obama is probably the prime example that growing up without an intact married mother-father family is not somehow destined for failure. It's not as if you don't have your married mom and dad, you're doomed to suffer throughout life. He's doing pretty well for himself. He's been elected to the presidency twice. But he would be the first to tell you that his road in life was tougher because his father wasn't there. President Obama, while he's not going to demonize single mothers, he's not somehow going to say that children in those family situations are destined to be failures, he is going to say that they have a steeper hill to climb through no fault of their own. And so the reason he's trying to break that cycle is that he wants every child to have what his 2 daughters have, that married mother and father. This then highlights why government's in the marriage business in the first place. The government is not in the marriage business because it cares about your love life. If marriage was simply about consenting adult love, we could get the state out of your bedrooms. The government's not in the marriage business because it cares about the butterflies that you get in your stomach when you fall in love. Government's in the marriage business because the sexual union of a man and a woman can produce a child, and that child deserves a mother and a father. And that when this doesn't happen, more or less everything that you should care about, if you care about social justice and limited government, if you care about the poor and you care about freedom, are better served by a healthy marriage culture. What we've seen over the past 40 years with the breakdown of the American family is that we've seen an increase for those populations of child poverty, a decrease in social mobility, an increase in crime, a decrease in employment, an increase in welfare spending. So everything you could care about, better served by intact, healthy marriages than by a big government that tries to pick up the broken pieces either in the forms of the welfare state or in the form of a police state. And you can think about this. The welfare state plays the role of the provider. The police state plays the role of the discipliner. When you don't have the father there, we see the government step in to fill those two roles. So let me move on to the last question about the consequences of redefining marriage. Because you could say, all right, we're tracking with you. We're following your argument. You've said that this revisionist view of marriage that says marriage is just about consenting adult love really can't explain what makes marriage different than friendship in general. That this vision of marriage just makes marriage into contract law. And so it's just a bad philosophy of marriage. We understand your alternative philosophy is about a comprehensive union of sexually complementary spouses. We understand why the government cares about this, because it's that sort of a relationship that can produce children and unite children with their mother and their father. And when that takes place, all sorts of social benefits follow. But how will allowing Adam and Steve to get married impact any of this? That's the next logical question to ask. How is redefining marriage going to impact this one way or the other? What's the big deal? Let me answer that. I have three specific points to make, and all three of them fall under the general rubric of ideas have consequences and bad ideas have bad consequences. What redefining marriage does is it replaces one vision of marriage, the comprehensive union ordered towards creating children and uniting children with their mom and their dad. It replaces that vision of marriage with a vision of marriage as consenting adult romance. And the law can't be neutral between these two visions. It's going to reinforce one vision or the other. And in doing so, the law will shape our culture. Our culture will then shape our beliefs, and our beliefs will then shape our actions. The technical term here is that the law has a pedagogical function to play, no matter what the law teaches. And it will either teach the truth about marriage, or it will teach a lie about marriage. And citizens will internalize either a truth about marriage or a lie about marriage. And then citizens will act on, and they will live out either a truth about marriage or a lie about marriage. And this is why what the law does matters. It matters for human flourishing of the entire community. So let me spell out the three ways in which a bad idea about marriage will have bad consequences. First, if you redefine marriage to make it a genderless institution, there will be no institution left in public life that upholds, even as an ideal, that every child deserves both a mother and a father. Indeed, saying that every child deserves a mother and a father will be relegated to hate speech. Redefining marriage to make it a genderless institution sends the signal that men and women are interchangeable, and therefore mothers and fathers are replaceable. Redefining marriage in this way takes an institution that had always had both horizontal and vertical dimensions. Horizontal was about the adult relationship, vertical was about the adult-to-child relationships. Marriage has traditionally been about both. What redefining marriage does instead is it makes it only about the adult romantic relationship. Redefining marriage makes it solely about the desires of the adults involved rather than the needs or the rights of the children involved. And if you doubt the capacity of the law to teach in this way, you only have to think through the case study of no-fault divorce. Prior to the introduction of no-fault divorce, if you sued for divorce, you would cite one of the 3 A's of common law: abuse, abandonment, and adultery. There were other reasons, but the 3 A's from the common law tradition are a nice way of summarizing the grounds for divorce. And what you would do is you would say, my relationship that had an expectation of being permanent needs to be severed because of a serious reason. My spouse is abusing me, my spouse has abandoned me, my spouse has committed adultery. With the introduction of no-fault divorce, you could now abandon your spouse for any reason, indeed for no reason at all. That's the idea behind no-fault divorce. You don't have to cite grounds for your divorce. Some legal scholars refer to it as unilateral no-fault divorce. Unilateral because you don't need the consent of the spouse who you're divorcing. So some legal scholars say that in most jurisdictions, you have a greater legal obligation to your roofer or your plumber than you do to your spouse. There's no such thing as unilateral, no-fault, get out of your plumbing contract. If you're going to renege on your plumbing contract, you either need the consent of your plumber or you need to show that the plumber messed something up. He installed leaking pipes. But you can't do a unilateral, no-fault, get out of your plumbing contract, and yet you can do that with the marital relationship. And so what happened in the 20 years after the introduction of no-fault divorce? Divorce rates more than doubled because the law taught something. The law taught that marriage need not even aspire to be a permanent relationship. You can get out of your marriage for frivolous reasons. Not all of the changes in our divorce took place because of the law. Culture shapes law, but so too the law shapes culture. And the law was now teaching something about marriage. Let me give you one other statistic. 50 years ago, when Senator Moynihan wrote his famous report, Moynihan wrote a report on the state of the family in the African American community in the United States. And Moynihan had pointed out that throughout slavery and Jim Crow, the black family had stayed intact. And yet now something was taking place that it was falling apart. The government was doing something with the welfare state to actually disintegrate the family. So Moynihan writes this report because at that time, births to single mothers in the black community were reaching 25%. In the general population, 50 years ago, births to single mothers were in single digits. And in the African American community, it was just approaching 25%. Fast forward to today. 40% of all Americans are born to single mothers, 50% of Hispanics, and 73% of African Americans. These children have done nothing wrong, and yet they will all face a tougher road in life through no fault of their own. And the question is, this fact set has led many people to say that the crisis of absentee fathers is the most important social justice issue in our nation, in our time. That these children, 40% of all children, 50% of Hispanics, 70% of African Americans, they deserve to have fathers. But how do we as a society insist that those fathers are essential when the law has redefined marriage to make fathers optional? That's the first consequence of legally redefining marriage to make it a genderless institution. It sends the signal that mothers and fathers are replaceable, that they're interchangeable. Second consequence is that there's no principled reason for the redefinition of marriage to stop with same-sex couples. That once you get rid of the male-female part of marriage, you open yourself up to an entire train of other redefinitions. And activists have already coined new words to describe where they would like to see marriage further redefined. So let me introduce you to 3 new words. Hopefully they're new. If you've already heard these words, you're on the cutting edge of activism. The first is the term throuple. A throuple is a 3-person couple. Take the word couple, chop off the C, and then add a THR. I came across this word a couple years ago in New York Magazine. New York Magazine is a run-of-the-mill publication for New York City. Subsequently, I've seen this populated in Slate, Salon, the Washingtonian magazine, and what it is, it's profiling various throuples that live in New York, live in Washington, D.C. A throuple is a type of polyamorous relationship. Polyamory is different than polygamy. With polygamy, you had one man with multiple wives, but a series of relationships. This man with that woman, this man with a different woman, this man with a third woman. With polyamory, it's group marriage. They're all married to each other. So New York Magazine was pointing out that this throuple, it's three men who live with each other and love each other. They cook meals for each other. They want to be able to visit each other in the hospital. They want to have all three names on the mortgage. They want to have all three names on the tax return. If you go before the U.S. Supreme Court and you sue for marriage equality for the same-sex couple, on what principle would you deny marriage equality to the same-sex throuple or to the opposite-sex quartet? The way that we arrived at monogamy in Western law and culture is that it's one man and one woman who can unite in the act that can produce new life, and every new life has one mother and one father. But once you say that aspect of marriage, the male-female procreation aspect of marriage is irrational and arbitrary and bigoted, what is your principled basis for monogamy? What's magical about the number 2 once you say male-female is irrational? The next term was in the New York Times Sunday magazine. This is probably the most prominent publication in all of American life. This is, if you're a writer, this is the type of publication that you want to be published in. If you're a public figure, this is the publication that you want to be profiled in. And so the New York Times Sunday magazine, about 4 years ago, they ran a profile of the gay rights activist Dan Savage. Savage is the guy behind the It Gets Better campaign. And they asked Savage, well, what will straight couples learn from gay couples? How will gay marriage actually strengthen the institution of marriage? And this is where he introduced the term monogamish. And so that's the second word here, monogamish. Savage said that straight couples could learn from gay couples the virtue of a monogamish relationship. Monogamish relationship is a play on the word monogamous. It's a two-person relationship, but it's sexually open. The title of the article in the New York Times was Married, with Infidelities. And so what Savage here was doing was redefining the vice of infidelity as the virtue of monogamish. His argument was that the problem with marriage in the United States is that we have this outdated, inhumane holdover from the Jewish and Christian traditions of expecting sexual exclusivity inside of marriage. That we have this outdated, inhumane vision that you can be faithful to one person for the rest of your life. And that this is the reason that there's so much marital discord. That much better if you had a caregiving or romantic emotional union where you were free to seek out sexual fulfillment with other partners. Savage's argument was that provided there's no coercion and there's no deceit, spouses should be free to have an open marriage. The last term was in the Washington Post about 1.5 years ago, written by a lawyer, and he introduced me to the term wed lease. Wed lease is a play on the word wedlock. And if wedlock denotes something that's strong and sturdy and permanent, wed lease was meant to denote the exact opposite. Just like you can lease a car or you can lease a house, this lawyer was arguing that you should be able to lease your spouse. He was arguing for expressly temporary marriage license. That the problem with marriage in the United States, that again, we have this outdated holdover from the Jewish and Christian traditions of expecting a commitment till death do us part. And that the reason that divorce is so traumatic for people is that they make an unrealistic expectation, that pledge of permanency, and then when they can't live up to that expectation, their hearts get broken and their lives fall apart. Much better to make a realistic commitment. Pledge to have a 5-year marriage. Pledge to have a wed lease rather than wedlock. This would be a more humane, better policy for marriage. Now, I said I'm not going to discuss theology or morality. So I'll leave it for you to judge whether the throuple and the wed lease and the monogamish relationship are good ideas theologically, good ideas from a moral perspective. I just want to speak about the public policy consequences. Remember that I said the reason that the governments in the marriage business is to get one man and one woman to commit to each other permanently and exclusively so that any children that they create have a mom and a dad. The throuple, the wed lease, the monogamous relationship directly undercut that policy purpose of marriage. What the throuple, the wed lease, and the monogamous relationships do is that they increase the number of sexual partners that men and women have, and they decrease the amount of commitment that they make to each other. There'll be multi-partner relationships that are sexually open that are only pledged for 5 or 10 years. What are the consequences of those sorts of relationships? There'll be an increase in fragmented families, an increase in fatherless children. Because the more sexual partners you have, the less commitment you make to your sexual partners, the greater the likelihood that you create children with multiple people, to whom you're not committed and to whom you will not be committed to the children. And yet all three of these redefinitions, the group marriage and the throuple, the temporary marriage and the wed lease, the open marriage in the monogamous relationship, all three of these redefinitions follow as a logical matter, just as night follows on day once you get rid of the male-female part of marriage. You can't deny as a matter of principle these further redefinitions once you say that the male-female part is simply irrational. So let me move on to the third consequence. This is the consequence that we've been living with the most in the here and now as we've been going through this experimentation with redefining marriage. This is the consequence for religious liberty. And the best way to understand what will happen here is to think, how does the law treat other people who engage in irrational bigotry? How does the law treat racists? This isn't to deny that racism exists in the United States, but it is to say that you can't really be an open racist and run for public office, or be the president of a university, or be the CEO of a major corporation. If the law teaches that believing that marriage is a male-female relationship is the functional equivalent of racism, the law will then treat people who believe marriage is a male-female relationship as the functional equivalent of racists. Whether that's in public life, whether that's in university life, or if that's in commercial life. And we have examples from all three domains. So we've already seen the fire chief in Atlanta, Georgia, fired from his job because he wrote a book for his Bible study. This happened just a month ago. This man wrote a book for his Bible study. He had been the fire administrator for the U.S. government under President Obama. He was appointed by President Obama to the U.S. fire administrator. He then went back to Atlanta and served as the fire chief, where he had been an Atlanta firefighter for 30-some years. He was now the chief of the department. And about a year ago, he wrote a book for the Bible study that he leads. It's a men's Bible study at his church. And 2 sentences in the entire book mentioned homosexuality. And because he taught the traditional Christian teaching, he was accused of having a discriminatory viewpoint, and that discriminatory viewpoint disqualified him from being the fire chief in Atlanta. And the mayor fired him just last month. Just a week ago, the California Supreme Court changed their ethics code to say that no California state judge can be a leader in the Boy Scouts. Because the Boy Scouts, while they admit gay scouts, they don't allow gay scout masters. And so the Boy Scouts engage in an invidious form of discrimination, and a judge can't be a member of the Boy Scouts because if you're a member of a group that discriminates, you're disqualified from being a judge. So we're already seeing in the public sector, public employees being forced to either compromise their beliefs and their ability to belong to Bible studies and to civic groups like the Boy Scouts, or give up their government leadership position. We've also seen this in the private sector. Brendan Eich was the founder and CEO of Mozilla Firefox. He gave a $1,000 donation to the Proposition 8 campaign back in 2008. He did this privately. He did this secretly. No one knew about it. until 6 years later, when someone was going through the disclosures of everyone who had donated money to the Prop 8 campaign, and someone noticed that Brendan Eich, the CEO of the most important tech company in Silicon Valley, was now declared to be a bigot. And the board forced him to resign from the company that he founded. And the chairman of the board of trustees, it was interesting when she did this, she says, you know, I've known Brendan for all of these years. I've never witnessed him to say anything bigoted. We've never had a complaint that he's been a bad boss or that he's discriminated against anyone in any way. It was simply because he had a viewpoint that was now deemed unacceptable that he was forced to resign. It's worth pointing out that Prop 8 won. He supported a cause, a political cause, that the majority of Californians supported, and he was forced out of his job. Now, both of those examples, well, the Brendan Eich example is kind of a voluntary society. It's the economy. The first two examples, the Atlanta fire chief and the California judges, those involve the government discriminating against individuals. Let me share you a couple other examples of that government discrimination. We've seen in Massachusetts, in Illinois, in San Francisco, and in Washington, D.C., Christian adoption agencies have been forced out of providing adoption and foster care for children because they wanted to find homes with married moms and dads for children. And the government said that's discrimination. If you don't treat married same-sex couples in the same way as you treat married mothers and fathers, you're engaging in discrimination, and we won't give you the license to run an adoption agency unless you place children on an equal basis with all married couples. We've then seen cases with bakers and florists and photographers and other professionals whose work intersects with the marriage industry punished by the government. Their only objection was to helping to celebrate a same-sex wedding. None of these professionals were saying we refuse to serve gays or lesbians. There was no baker, photographer, or florist who said, well, we just have a blanket policy of we don't bake cakes for someone who's gay, or we don't do flowers for some. They were happy to bake the birthday cake. They were happy to do the get well soon floral arrangements. In the case of the florist in the Pacific Northwest, she had been serving a gay couple for about a decade prior to when they asked her to do their same-sex wedding flowers. And that's where she said, well, I can't do that. That would violate my beliefs about marriage. I don't want to use my God-given artistic talents to help celebrate something that I think violates God's teaching on marriage. And the baker, the photographers, the florist, a farmer up in New York State, they have all been sued and forced to pay fines for violating the human rights of the same-sex couples. The farmers that I mentioned, they live in upstate New York. They have a farm. They open up their family barn for about a dozen weddings a year. This is a type of farm that you go for apple picking and pumpkin festivals around Halloween, fall festivals. And they live on the second and the third floor of their barn, and then they use the first floor for about a dozen weddings a year. They were asked by a lesbian couple, can we get married at your barn? And they said, look, we're faithful Christians. We can't have a gay wedding in our house. They were sued. The court system in New York State said that they violated the New York Human Rights Statute, and they were forced to pay a $13,000 fine. Right now, there's a baker in, I can't remember if it's Washington State or Oregon, who just last week, the judge said that the trial could go forward and she stands to pay a $150,000 fine if she loses her case. This is not a live and let live situation. It's not as if conservative Christians have a monopoly on cake baking and flower arranging and photography. There are plenty of other florists and bakers and photographers who, one, support gay marriage, and two, are interested in making money. If you wanted to see a live and let live solution, you would say, go to a different baker, go to a different florist, go to a different photographer. There's no need to coerce or penalize the Christian photographer, baker, and florist, and yet that's what is consistently happening with government approval, with courts issuing rulings against the business people. So with that, I'm looking at the clock. I'm out of time it's more or less all that I wanted to say this morning. And I guess I'll be back this afternoon for the question and answer period, and I look forward to discussing with you guys then. Thank you.